have we ever seen anything like this? The EU borrowing so much money for the collective?
No, we haven't, and the big politicians have been very sort of careful to say that this is historic, unprecedented. Partly because it's such a huge amount of money, and I think also partly because politically this is important. It's symbolic. It's something where the EU has come together to prove its value at a time of crisis. A coordinated action. They've leveraged their AAA rating on the money markets. So absolutely unprecedented, but also politically important too.
All right. So what will it do?
Well, that's a good question. And I think we need to be careful not to be overconfident. We've seen the market reaction, as we heard in the piece there. If you look at the individual European markets, the German DAX, for example, that's up higher than its closing price on the 31st of December 2019, before the COVID crisis started, which is a heck of an achievement. And there is a real sense that European manufacturers now might finally be facing rejuvenated markets as a result of the deal. So customers, hopefully, who have been suffering, might finally now develop the confidence and also the means to start buying again. But we need to be very careful and measured about this. Stimulus packages always sound huge because of the numbers involved, and they haven't necessarily worked. They haven't at least been the silver bullet in the past. There's a lot more to do. There's a lot bigger barriers to overcome in the global economy than just this stimulus will sort out.
And there was a lot of talk about green projects and that these are grants, so that the money doesn't need to get paid back. But somebody has to pay back the loans. Explain where that money is going to come from.
Well, this is a really important point, Peter, and this is what the so-called frugal four were hesitant and arguing against during the marathon meeting that the council's just come through. So Sweden, Denmark, Austria, the Netherlands, also Finland, apparently caused President Macron such frustration that he banged the table with his fist and warned them that they were threatening the entire European project. So there has been pushback against the idea of giving those nations who have suffered the most from the pandemic grants, but equally loans. All borrowed money at some point has to be paid back. Now, essentially, if you issue bonds, if you borrow and leverage your credit worthiness as a nation on the international markets, it is reasonably straightforward to get hold of money. If you invest that in terms of infrastructure in your countries, it can also create wealth and jobs. But ultimately, that money does have to, in some form, be paid back. And so all of these nations are trying to figure out that sort of balance. They're walking that tightrope between getting confidence back in the market, but also not making sure we're not paying back debt for decades and decades to come.
Who will get, of those 27 nations, these grants? Is it everybody, or only a few of those countries actually who qualify in terms of need?
Yeah, well, for the grants, it's a bit different, and there still is the technical negotiation phase to work through. So there's two things that need to happen still in the process. It needs to be ratified by the European Parliament, and it also needs to have a series of technical negotiations completed. So the small print still needs to be worked out, but it's almost certainly going to be Italy and Spain who will be the major recipients of these grants. And of course, then that causes all sorts of political discussions and debates and arguments from the other nations too, that perhaps feel that they're just as worthy of that money.
All right. So the United Kingdom, interesting in that they've been trying to get out of Europe for the longest. Perhaps this is a great time to be part of this bigger family. What does happen though? Because if they do benefit from this, they're going to be out of the EU at some point before the loans get paid back.
Yeah, and this is one of those sort of small print issues. Appreciate it's small print, but not small numbers. But nevertheless, those technical details that still need to be worked through. And one of the problems that we've got is underneath the enormous challenge of the COVID crisis, we've got the sort of spectre of Brexit still looming. As we've spoken about on this show before, still really in a stalemate position. Both sides waiting and hoping for an 11th hour resolution with the clock ticking. Most people think that it's going to be well into the autumn before any sort of detail of a trade agreement is finalised. But it could even be longer because the whole world's been distracted by this crisis, quite understandably. But Brexit certainly is there in the background. Even if we successfully manage to navigate through this, even if vaccines come quicker than have been predicted, we still have Brexit, which, unless it's unless it's done in a very smooth way, it's certainly going to impact the global economy.
750 billion sounds like a lot. And I suppose if there isn't a second wave, because there's always these scenarios, isn't there, then it might be fine. But if there is a second wave, what then?
Well, this is it. We've got big ticket items that are problems that we haven't neatly solved, irrespective of COVID. We're still grappling globally with productivity issues. That's something that as a global economic community we haven't really got a neat answer to. We're not sure how to deal with China. It's problematic both economically and politically. And we've obviously, as I've just said, got the issue of Brexit and how that's going to create a ripple effect around the world. So we're trying to solve all these things at the same time. If we get further issues, if we don't get the vaccine as soon as has been predicted or hoped for, well, then we could be in a very, very difficult situation indeed. And that's something that nobody wants. The last thing you want when you start to see some green shoots is to then have it revealed that it's false hope. That really does put distrust out there, and that's a very bad thing for financial markets.
All right. Each country has its own needs and issues that they consider urgent. How will they make sure that these funds are used properly and not allocated to things perhaps that shouldn't fall under this COVID recovery package?
Yeah, well, that's an important part, and it was touched on in the piece there. And like you or I applying for a loan, Peter, the countries will need to submit an actual application. They are going to be subjected to checks to check that the money is not being misused, and also additionally, a major difference to you or I taking out a loan is that the majority of European states will essentially have the power to block individual aspects of applications, so specific projects that they don't like. And there's quite a long list of criteria that people are going to have to abide by when they're submitting these applications, and making sure there's a contribution, a meaningful contribution to the green economy is one of them. So it's not just as simple as sort of stretching out a hand and the money's there. It really is a case of having to prove that it's going to the right places.
All right. On a political front, at the beginning, you talked about Macron slamming his fist on the table. I wonder, you've got the Frugal Four and those that were trying to push this deal forward. Is there a little bit of a shift in power play within the EU, especially amongst the big hitters?
Yeah, I think President Macron has always seen himself as being right at the centre of the project, and I think, as I said before, this represents the first opportunity really since the rather faulty stimulus negotiations that the ECB had a few months back. This represents a real platform for President Macron and others to demonstrate the virtue, the power, the utility, if you like, of the EU. We've had a lot of criticism. Brexit has perhaps caused critics and skeptics of Europe all around the world to sort of come forward and start poking holes in deficiencies in the union. But I think this really represents a chance politically for those advocates like President Macron to say, look what we've done. this is an important thing, and it's going to have a tremendously positive effect on economies after this terrible crisis.
All right. Look, we got a bit of a bounce with our rand here, and I suppose this is all optimism that what might happen is that if these first world economies, developing nations, economies lift up, then we will get a break on that. I'm just looking and wondering about what do you see as a reasonable timeline where we can start to say, okay, the money's in, it's been put to bed, we're going to start to see green shoots at what point?
Well, I think we are already starting to see some tiny green shoots. At the moment, they're tiny and they're isolated cases, but they're not insignificant. So there are a number of industries, a number of quite large companies who have actually done quite well out of this crisis. So there was news a couple of days ago that the big company Hermes, the delivery company, they're actually this week adding 10,000 new jobs in the UK because they're so overwhelmed at the increase in online retail. There are also biotech companies that have been doing particularly well. There are home working related companies that have been succeeding. So there are individual green shoots poking up. It's yet, of course, insignificant compared to the huge damage that's been done by no planes in the sky, supply chains grinding to a halt the world over. But I think what we're going to start to see, as well as the turmoil, as well as the turbulence, is also see newer companies emerging, companies doing things differently and embracing what could be a completely new way that we all behave. And that, I think, is reasonably encouraging.